The scent of industrial bleach and ozone was the only constant in Anya's life. It clung to her clothes, her hair, her skin. It was the smell of erasure, of scrubbing away the day's grime from the polished concrete floors of Forward Operating Base Erebus. The high-altitude listening post was a monument to paranoia, a concrete and steel dagger driven into the heart of a frozen mountain range, bristling with antennae that drank secrets from the sky. Inside, the air hummed with the ceaseless thrum of servers and the low murmur of filtered air. To the young soldiers stationed here, men and women a generation younger than her, she was just another part of the base's machinery. The quiet woman who pushed a mop, emptied their trash, and never met their eyes. They saw the tired lines around her eyes, the gray streaks in her tightly bound hair, and the slight limp she favored on cold mornings. They saw a janitor. Nothing more. "Hey, Anya, miss a spot," Corporal Diaz called out, pointing a boot at an imaginary scuff mark near the entrance to the comms center. He grinned, a flash of white in a face still soft with youth. Private Chen, beside him, snickered into his hand. They were data analysts, their war fought on glowing screens in climate-controlled rooms. To them, physical labor was a novelty, a subject for casual mockery. Anya didn't respond. She didn't even look up. Her world was the floor, a 10-foot square she was methodically stripping and waxing. The rhythmic scrape of her buffer was the only answer she gave. Her silence was a wall they could never breach, and it irritated them. They mistook it for subservience, for the dull acceptance of a life lived on the bottom rung. They couldn't see the coiled stillness in her posture, the way her eyes, even when downcast, scanned every reflection, every shadow, cataloging exits and angles. "Leave her be," Sergeant Miller grunted, walking past them. He was older, a career NCO with a face like a worn catcher's mitt. He didn't join in the mockery, but he offered no protection either. In his eyes, Anya was simply irrelevant, a ghost in a gray jumpsuit. She finished her section, the buffer's drone winding down. The floor gleamed under the sterile fluorescent lights, a perfect, unblemished mirror. She packed her supplies onto the cart, her movements economical, betraying a discipline that had nothing to do with janitorial work. Each bottle was returned to its specific clip, each rag folded into a precise square. It was a ritual, a way of imposing order on a small corner of a chaotic world. As she pushed the cart down the long, sterile corridor, the echo of Diaz's laughter followed her, a small, insignificant sound in the vast, humming silence of the base. She felt nothing. Feeling was a luxury she had discarded long ago, along with her name, her rank, and the life that had been burned away to leave this quiet, empty shell. The arrival of General Marcus Thorne sent a ripple of tension through the entire facility. Helicopters beat the thin mountain air into submission, and a retinue of stern-faced aides swept through the corridors like a cold front. Thorne was a man carved from granite and impatience, the architect of the military's entire signals intelligence network. Erebus was his crown jewel, and his inspections were legendary for their brutal thoroughness. Soldiers snapped to attention, their spines rigid, their faces masks of professional deference. The entire base was on edge, a collective breath held in anticipation of the general's judgment. Anya, however, continued her work. Command visits were irrelevant. Generals and privates alike tracked dirt on her floors. Her job remained the same. She was cleaning the small observation lounge overlooking the main operations floor when he entered. The room was all glass and brushed steel, with a panoramic view of the dozens of analysts at their stations below. General Thorne stood at the window, his hands clasped behind his back, a titan surveying his domain. His aide, a young, nervous captain, stood beside him, holding a tablet. "Response times are down 3% in the eastern sector," Thorne said, his voice a low growl that cut through the hum of the facility. "Why?" "Atmospheric interference, sir. A solar flare is degrading the satellite uplink," the captain stammered. "Excuses," Thorne spat. He turned, and for the first time his gaze fell upon Anya. He didn't see a person. He saw an obstacle, a gray smudge in his pristine facility. She was on her hands and knees, meticulously cleaning a coffee stain near his polished boots. "Get her out of here," he said, not to Anya, but to the captain, as if she were a piece of furniture to be moved. The captain cleared his throat. "Ma'am, could you perhaps finish this later? The general is conducting his inspection." Anya didn't look up. She simply finished wiping the last of the brown residue from the floor, squeezed the rag into her bucket, and rose with a quiet grace that seemed out of place. Her eyes, for a fleeting second, met the general's. They were a pale, washed-out gray, like a winter sky, and held a profound emptiness that was almost unnerving. There was no defiance in them, no fear, no resentment. There was nothing. It was like looking into a deep, cold well. Thorne felt a flicker of something. Annoyance, perhaps, or a strange, unidentifiable chill. He dismissed it instantly. He was a man who dealt in absolutes, in data and strategy. The inner life of a janitor was less than a rounding error to him. He turned back to the window, his attention already refocused on the glowing map displays below. "I want a full diagnostic on the entire array. I don't care about the sun. I want my data. Make it happen." As Anya pushed her cart out of the room, she heard Diaz's voice from the corridor. He was part of the general's honor guard, standing stiffly at the door. "See? Even the top brass knows where the help belongs," he whispered to Chan, a smug grin on his face. Anya pushed her cart down the hall, the slight squeak of a loose wheel the only sound. The general's dismissal, the soldier's mockery. It was all just noise. White noise. The kind you learn to filter out so you can hear the things that really matter. The subtle change in the ventilation system's pitch. The weight of a footstep on the floor plates. The faint, almost subliminal click of a door lock engaging when it shouldn't. She had been hearing those clicks all morning. Tiny, anomalous sounds lost in the symphony of the bass. But to her, they were notes in a song she knew all too well. A song that always ended in blood. The crisis did not announce itself with a bang, but with a whisper. A sudden, profound silence. The omnipresent hum of the servers, the lifeblood of the base, died. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire facility into an abyssal darkness, broken only by the emergency lights that cast everything in a sickly, pulsating red. A collective gasp went through the operations floor, followed by a frantic clatter of keyboards as analysts tried to coax their dead screens back to life. Then came the second sound. A high-pitched shriek from the comms system, a spike of feedback that felt like a needle in the ear, before it too fell silent. They were blind, deaf, and alone. In the observation lounge, General Thorne swore, a sharp, violent curse. What the hell was that? Backup power. Now! The captain fumbled with a wall panel. "It's not responding, sir. The entire system is offline. It's not a failure. It's been severed." Panic, cold and sharp, began to snake through the corridors. The soldiers were highly trained, but they were analysts and technicians, not infantry. Their muscle memory was in their fingers on a keyboard, not on the trigger of a rifle. Anya had been in the lower-level storage bay when the power died. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She simply froze, her hand resting on the handle of her mop. The darkness was a familiar blanket. The silence was an old friend. She stood perfectly still for a full 10 seconds, her head tilted, listening. The red emergency strobes pulsed, creating phantom movements in the long shadows of the shelving units. She heard it then, not the panicked shouting of the soldiers upstairs. Something else. The soft, rhythmic scuff of rubber-soled boots moving in unison. The quiet, metallic click of a weapon's safety being disengaged. They were already inside. This wasn't a systems failure. It was an infiltration. Professional one. The power cut, the comms jam, it was all textbook. They were cutting the head off the snake before it could even realize it was under attack. Upstairs, chaos reigned. Sergeant Miller was trying to organize a defensive perimeter near the command center, but his men were disoriented, fumbling with sidearms they rarely drew. They were trained for threats that came through fiber optic cables, not through breached doorways. Secure the command center. Lock it down. General Thorne's voice boomed from the observation lounge, but his orders were swallowed by the rising tide of fear. He was trapped, a king in a glass castle, watching his kingdom crumble. Down in the storage bay, Anya moved. Her previous lethargy vanished, replaced by a fluid efficiency that was terrifying to behold. There was no panic in her actions, only a cold, hard purpose. She abandoned her cart, but not before her hands moved over it with practiced speed. She took a spray bottle of concentrated ammonia solution. She took a roll of thick, fibrous duct tape. She unthreaded the heavy steel handle from her mop. It was solid, perfectly weighted. She moved not towards the sounds of the friendly soldiers, but away from them, melting into the deeper shadows of the service corridors. She knew these passages better than anyone on the base. She had cleaned every inch of them. She knew the loose floor grate in Sector Gamma, the faulty vent cover in the primary conduit, the precise acoustics of every junction. The base was her weapon. She heard them before she saw them. 4 of them, moving in a tight diamond formation down the main service corridor. They were clad in black tactical gear, no insignia, their faces obscured by anti-flash goggles and balaclavas. They carried suppressed carbines held at the low ready. Professionals. They swept their sectors with methodical precision, their movements economical and deadly. They weren't here to kill everyone. They had a specific target, the server core, the brain of Erebus. Anya flattened herself into a recessed alcove that housed a fire extinguisher, the red strobes flashing over her without revealing her form. Her breathing was slow and even, her heart a steady, cold drum. She was no longer a janitor. The gray, empty woman was gone. In her place was something else, something older and far more dangerous. The muscle memory, buried under years of bleach and wax, was reasserting itself. The point man passed her alcove, then the second. As the third drew level, she exploded from the shadows. It was not a fight. It was a sequence of brutal, efficient actions. The heavy steel mop handle swung in a tight, vicious arc, connecting with the third man's temple. Not the helmet, but the soft spot just below it. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud in the quiet corridor. He went down without a sound. Before the fourth man, the rear guard, could even register his partner's fall, Anya was on him. She didn't go for his weapon. She sprayed the concentrated ammonia directly into his face. He screamed, a muffled, wet sound from behind his mask, clawing at his goggles as the caustic chemical seared his eyes and lungs. As he stumbled back, blinded and choking, she drove the end of the mop handle into his throat, crushing his larynx. He collapsed, twitching. 2 down. The first 2, the point men, were already turning, raising their weapons. But Anya was gone. She had melted back into the intersecting maintenance tunnel before they could acquire a target. They saw their fallen comrades, and for the first time, their perfect discipline wavered. Confusion rippled between them. They had expected panic technicians, not a ghost that struck from the walls. Anya didn't stop. She didn't pause to savor her victory. She was already moving, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete. She knew their objective. The server core was on sublevel 3, protected by a maglocked blast door. The soldiers under Sergeant Miller were trying to form a defense on the main level, which meant the lower levels were a ghost town. The enemy had a clear path, except for her. She moved through the ventilation system, a tight, claustrophobic space thick with dust and the smell of old oil. The schematics of the ducts were etched into her mind from the countless hours she'd spent cleaning and maintaining them. It was a dark, suffocating maze, but it was a direct route, bypassing the main corridors the enemy would be sweeping. She could hear them below her, their radio chatter now audible, clipped and professional, but with a new edge of caution. They were reporting contact. An unknown hostile. Singular. She dropped out of a vent into the chilly, silent server room. Rows upon rows of black monoliths stood in the darkness, their dormant indicator lights like a field of sleeping red eyes. The air was cold, the fan noise absent. Felt like a tomb. Across the room was the primary control terminal, the one thing that could manually trigger the base's emergency data purge. A complete, cascading wipe of every petabyte of information Erebus held. If she couldn't stop them from taking the data, she would destroy it. The heavy thud of a breaching charge being placed on the server room's main door echoed through the space. They were here. Anya took her position behind a thick server rack, the steel mop handle held in a two-handed grip. Her breathing was controlled, her body a coiled spring. The red emergency light pulsed, bathing the room in blood-hued flashes. One woman, one steel pipe, against a team of elite soldiers. The odds were laughable. But Anya wasn't laughing. She was waiting. The charge blew. The blast door screamed inward, torn from its hinges in a shower of sparks and concrete dust. Smoke and the acrid smell of explosives filled the room. Through the haze, 3 figures emerged, moving in a low, tight formation, their weapon-mounted lights cutting brilliant white swathes through the red gloom. They were the remainder of the initial team reinforced. They swept the room with practiced ease, their carbines ready. Clear left. One of them murmured into his throat mic. Clear right. No contacts. Move to the central terminal. Plant the extraction drive. 2 minutes. They moved past Anya's position. They were looking for soldiers for an organized defense. They were not looking for a janitor hiding in the shadows. Their focus was the terminal. That was their mistake. As the last man passed her rack, she moved. A blur of gray. She didn't use the mop handle this time. It was too loud, too crude for this close work. Instead, she grabbed the roll of duct tape from her belt. In one fluid motion, she looped it over his head, covering his mouth and nose, and pulled back, hard. Her other hand came up, fingers rigid, and jabbed into the soft spot under his jaw, severing a nerve cluster. His body went rigid, his weapon clattering to the floor as he choked silently. His eyes wide with shock before they rolled back in his head. She lowered his body gently, making no sound. The 2 at the terminal were focused on their task, one plugging a device into the interface while the other stood guard, facing the breech door. Anya crept forward, her bare feet making no purchase on the smooth, cold floor. She picked up the fallen soldier's carbine, felt familiar in her hands, an old and terrible weight. She checked the magazine, the selector switch. Her movements were automatic, ingrained by a past she tried to forget every single day. The soldier standing guard sensed something, a subtle shift in the air, the flicker of a shadow that didn't belong. He began to turn. He never completed the motion. Anya fired a single, controlled 2-round burst. The suppressed weapon made a sound like a hard cough. The rounds punched through the back of his helmet, and he crumpled to the floor in a heap. The last man, the technician, spun around, his own sidearm coming up. He was fast. But Anya was already moving, using the server racks as cover, a ghost flitting between monoliths of silent data. The technician fired wildly, his unsuppressed pistol cracking loudly in the enclosed space, the bullets sparking off the metal racks. Anya didn't fire back. Ammunition was a resource. Noise was a liability. She circled him, her movements a study in predatory patience. He was panicking now, his breathing ragged, turning in circles trying to find her. "Where are you?" he hissed into the darkness. Anya emerged behind him. She had the steel mop handle again. He turned, his eyes widening as he saw her. This woman in a janitor's jumpsuit, her face impassive, her gray eyes as cold and dead as the servers around them. He tried to raise his pistol, but she was too close. The pipe swung, not at his head, but at his wrist. The sound of bone snapping was sharp and clear. The pistol flew from his numb fingers. A second swing caught him across the knees, buckling his legs. He fell to the ground, screaming. Anya stood over him, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. She looked at the data extraction device still plugged into the terminal. Its screen was flashing, a progress bar almost at completion. She reached down and ripped it out, tossing it to the floor. Then she turned to the keyboard. Her fingers, calloused from years of pushing a mop, flew across the keys. She wasn't just guessing. She was inputting a series of override commands, her knowledge of the system's backdoors shockingly intimate. The screen flickered, demanding a final authorization. Code word. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. She typed a single word, Karakurt. The screen flashed green. Access granted. System purge initiated. A low hum began to build in the room as the servers began to systematically destroy their own contents. It was done. Whatever they had come for was now turning into meaningless digital noise. Her work finished. The adrenaline began to recede, and the pain registered. A piece of shrapnel from the breaching charge had torn a deep gash in her left forearm. Blood was soaking the sleeve of her gray jumpsuit, dripping onto the pristine floor. She tore a strip from the bottom of her uniform and began to wrap the wound, her movements precise and detached, as if tending to a machine. That was when the soldiers arrived. Sergeant Miller and his squad, including Diaz and Chun, finally fought their way down to the sublevel. They stormed the breached doorway, weapons raised, expecting a firefight. Instead, they found a scene of quiet carnage. 3 dead hostiles in black tactical gear, another on the floor, alive but broken, and in the center of it all, the janitor. She was leaning against a server rack, finishing the makeshift bandage on her arm. Her face, illuminated by the red strobes, was a blank mask of exhaustion. "Holy!" Miller breathed, lowering his rifle. Diaz and Chun stared, their mouths agape. They looked from the dead, professional soldiers to the quiet woman in the blood-stained jumpsuit. It didn't compute. The image was so dissonant, so utterly impossible, that their minds struggled to process it. "Anya," Diaz whispered, his voice cracking. What did you do?" She didn't answer. She looked at the blood dripping from her arm onto the floor, and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. A stain. Another mess to clean. Just then, General Thorne and his aides appeared in the ruined doorway, their faces grim. They had heard the pistol shots and feared the worst. Thorne's eyes swept the room, taking in the dead intruders, the neutralized technician, and the humming, wiping servers. His gaze finally settled on Anya, leaning against the rack, a figure of impossible contradictions. "Medic!" he barked, his command voice returning. "Get this woman looked at. Sergeant, report. What happened here?" Miller was at a loss for words. "Sir, we found it like this. All of them down. And her," he pointed a trembling finger at Anya. Thorne strode forward, his expression a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. He saw her as a complication, an anomaly in his report. Maybe she was a hostage, a lucky survivor. He stopped in front of her, his shadow falling over her. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice hard. Anya looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. She didn't speak. She was tired. The violence was over, and the emptiness was flowing back in. She just wanted to be left alone. She shifted her weight, and the crude bandage on her arm slipped, loosened by the movement. The blood-soaked fabric fell away, revealing the skin of her forearm, and the tattoo. It was old. The ink faded to a deep blue-gray, but the design was stark and unmistakable. A stylized black raven, its wings spread as if in silent flight. In its talons it clutched a compass rose, but the needle was shattered, pointing in all directions at once. It was a symbol of being lost and yet still deadly, of operating without guidance, without a true north. General Thorne froze. His mouth, which had been open to bark another order, snapped shut. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pallor of pure shock. His eyes, wide with disbelief, were locked on the tattoo. The entire room seemed to fall silent, the hum of the dying servers the only sound. The air crackled with a sudden, unbearable tension. The general's aides, Sergeant Miller, Diaz, Chan, they all watched, confused by his sudden paralysis. They saw a tattoo. The general saw a ghost. He took a half-step back, an involuntary movement of profound awe and something that looked terrifyingly like fear. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not a command. It was a whisper, a breath of utter reverence that was more powerful than any shout. "Karakurt," he breathed. The name hung in the air, meaningless to everyone but the two of them. It was a name from a dead file, a classified ghost story told by intelligence officers to scare rookies. The Karakurt program, a deniable operations unit, officially disbanded and disavowed 2 decades ago after a mission in Eastern Europe went catastrophically wrong. They were specters, assassins and saboteurs recruited from the darkest corners of the special forces. Their identities erased, their lives forfeit. They were sent to places that didn't exist on any map, to fight wars that were never declared. They were considered the most lethal operators the service had ever produced. And they were all supposed to be dead. The official record listed every member as killed in action. Anya's face remained impassive, but her eyes narrowed slightly at the sound of the name. It was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 20 years. Thorne swallowed hard, his military bearing completely shattered. He looked from the tattoo to her face, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the faint, silvery scar that traced her hairline, the unnatural stillness of her posture, the cold, ancient knowledge in her eyes. He wasn't looking at a janitor. He was standing in the presence of a legend. He cleared his throat, his voice still trembling slightly. He asked a question, a low murmur in a language the others didn't recognize, a coded phrase, a challenge and response known only to a select few who had access to the highest levels of Black Project clearance. "Shattered compass shows no path," he said, his voice barely audible. Anya's gaze held his. After a long moment, she replied, her own voice rusty from disuse, the words a ghost of a forgotten life. "But the Raven still knows the way home." The response slammed into General Thorne like a physical blow. It was correct. It was the sign and countersign of a unit whose very existence was a state secret. The impossible was standing right in front of him, bleeding on the floor of his command center. The shift in the room was palpable. Diaz and Chun, standing nearby, had heard the exchange. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the general's reaction. They saw the awe, the reverence on the face of a man they considered a god of war. They looked at Anya, at the woman they had mocked for spilling mop water, and a sickening wave of shame and terror washed over them. Their casual cruelty was suddenly exposed as the ignorant posturing of children in the presence of something ancient and terrible. General Thorne straightened his back. His movements were slow, deliberate. He ignored his aides, his soldiers, the dead bodies on the floor. His entire world had narrowed to the quiet, unassuming woman in front of him. He brought his right hand up, not in a casual gesture, but in a slow, formal salute. The motion was crisp, perfect, imbued with a weight of respect he had not shown to anyone in decades. It was a salute of a soldier to a superior, a warrior to a legend. Sergeant Miller, seeing his general's action, reacted on instinct. He snapped to attention and saluted. One by one, the other soldiers in the room, even the wounded, followed suit. They didn't know why. They only knew that their commander, one of the most powerful men in the military, was paying homage. Diaz and Chun were the last, their hands rising shakily, their faces pale with the dawning, horrifying realization of who and what they had been tormenting. The server room, a place of carnage and chaos, was now a place of silent, solemn tribute. A phalanx of armed soldiers, led by a 4-star general, stood at attention, saluting the janitor. Anya did not return the salute. She simply watched them, her gray eyes holding a universe of weariness. This was the world she had run from. The salutes, the ranks, the killing. She had traded it all for a bucket and a mop, for the quiet anonymity of being invisible. And now it had found her again. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement not of rank, but of a shared, bloody history. Then she turned her attention back to the wound on her arm, the quiet, mundane task of staunching the flow of her own blood. Weeks bled into one another. The official investigation into the attack on Erebus was a whirlwind of activity. Men in dark suits with cold eyes came and went, their briefcases full of questions. They interviewed every soldier on the base, from General Thorne down to the lowest private. They analyzed every frame of security footage, every corrupted data log. Their final report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. It concluded that the attack was repelled by the timely and heroic actions of Sergeant Miller's squad, aided by a series of fortuitous system malfunctions that hindered the enemy's progress. A number of commendations were issued. Anya Petrova's name appeared only once, listed as a civilian employee who was injured during the incident. She was offered a medal for civilian service, a generous severance package, and a quiet transfer to another facility. She refused it all. She refused to be interviewed. She refused to be acknowledged. When the investigators tried to press her, General Thorne intervened personally. He made a single, encrypted call to the Pentagon, and the investigators were recalled the next day, their questions left unanswered. Anya was to be left alone. The order was absolute. Life on the base slowly returned to a semblance of normality. The breach door was replaced. The damaged servers were swapped out. The scorch marks on the walls were painted over. But the atmosphere had changed. The casual arrogance of the younger soldiers was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. They still saw her in the corridors, pushing her cart, her gray jumpsuit immaculate. But they no longer saw a janitor. They saw the woman who had walked through fire and emerged untouched. Corporal Diaz would now flatten himself against the wall when she passed, his eyes fixed on the floor, a silent apology in his posture. Private Chun once tried to help her lift a heavy bucket, and she simply looked at him, her gaze so empty and profound that he dropped the handle and backed away without a word. They left her to her silence. They understood, finally, that her solitude was not a weakness, but a choice, a sanctuary. One night, long after the last shift change, Anya was back in the server room. The new servers hummed with a quiet, confident energy. The lights were no longer a sterile white, but a soft, cool blue. Everything was clean, orderly, and peaceful. Almost everything. On the floor, near the central terminal, was a deep, jagged scratch in the polished concrete. A scar left by the shrapnel from the breaching charge. A final, stubborn imperfection. She was on her hands and knees, a soft cloth in her hand, meticulously working a polishing compound into the mark. The work was slow, methodical. It was her ritual, erasing the past one scratch at a time. The door hissed open. General Thorne entered, alone and out of uniform. He wore simple gray fatigues, his insignia of rank removed. He didn't speak, just stood in the doorway and watched her. He watched as she worked, her focus absolute, as if healing the small wound in the floor was the most important task in the world. He understood what she was doing. She wasn't just cleaning a floor. She was reclaiming her peace. After several long minutes of silence, he walked over to a nearby console and placed a small, unmarked black box on its surface. He looked at her one last time, his expression a complex mixture of gratitude, awe, and a deep, abiding sorrow for what her life must have been. He gave a slight nod and left as silently as he had arrived. Anya finished her work. The scratch was gone, the floor a perfect, seamless mirror once more. She rose, her knees aching slightly, and walked over to the console. She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were two items. On one side was a brand new, perfectly folded gray janitorial jumpsuit. On the other was a small, circular piece of dark, burnished metal. It wasn't a formal medal. It was a challenge coin, the kind elite units mint for their members. On its face was the same sigil as her tattoo, a black raven clutching a shattered compass. It was newly struck, the details sharp and clear, a silent acknowledgement, a symbol of a tribe that no longer existed, a message from one old soldier to another. She picked up the coin. It was heavy, cold in her palm. She looked at it for a long moment, the reflection of the blue server lights glinting on its surface. Then, she slipped it into the pocket of her worn jumpsuit, closed the box, and pushed her cart out of the server room. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the jagged mountain peaks in shades of violet and gray. Anya headed for the mess hall. The breakfast shift would be starting soon, and they would track dirt all over the floors. Her work was never done.